occupation of our country. We the people have fought them on every front.
We once again found a secluded room away from the madness out on the show floor. You guys can probably not hear this, but the entire room is shaking from the music and the noise outside. But we're here with David from Kaos Studios, and you guys are working on Homefront.
Yep.
So just tell people, what is Homefront?
So Homefront is a first-person shooter, and it revolves heavily around its premise. It's set in occupied America in the year 2027, and it's not just about having combat with America as a backdrop. We actually really want people to be able to explore what it would be like to play in a world where America was occupied. When we came up with the concept, we asked ourselves a what-if question. We said, what if America was occupied? What would it be like to experience that? And everything we've done has stemmed from that. So that's the core premise of the game, and you don't play as conventional military, you play as a civilian resistance. Civilians turn freedom fighters. Things go wrong, mistakes happen, and it's also really about the human side of the story. We're working with John Milius, who's the writer and director of Red Dawn and Apocalypse Now, and to really deliver this emotional depth and this dramatic intensity that you don't get in a lot of shooters. Homefront's obviously very important, the combat in it, but it's also very important for us to allow players to explore how the civilians would adapt to this world. And one of our sort of X statements for the premise is the familiar has become alien. So places that you're familiar with from TV or film in the U.S. or that Americans have grown up in, suburbs and shopping malls and places where you raise your kids, these have all been twisted by this occupation. So the game takes place in 2027. The EMP strike that's launched by the Greater Korean Federation happens in 2025. So you actually get to experience America 2 years into it and see how it's been twisted and changed.
So yeah, you mentioned the Greater Korean Coalition. Greater Korean Republic. So who are they?
So it begins with North Korea, and if you know anything about North Korea, you know that since the Korean War, since the 1960s, they have this hatred towards the West, at least the regime does. And so we tell a story of how North Korea, Kim Jong-il, he actually dies a few years in the future, passes on to his son, Kim Jong-un, and he unifies Korea, and then Japan comes into the mix, and some of the Southeastern Asian countries come into the mix. And we put a lot of time into the backstory to kind of set up how this has happened. We're not really saying, this is going to happen. It's more like this is what did happen in the Homefront lore and in the Homefront fiction. But it's not a game about North Korea. It's really a game about experiencing occupied USA.
Yeah, isn't that for Americans? We've seen similar concepts in game before. You mentioned you play as freedom fighters. We have the game Freedom Fighters, which has a similar concept, but it is a communist Russian regime, I believe. But how is it to tackle? It must be really sensitive for Americans to think about their country occupied by, probably some form of communistic force.
Yeah, it really hasn't been done that much. There's Freedom Fighters and, World in Conflict, the RTS, but it's a path that hasn't been treaded that heavily, and so we really want to bring something fresh and unique to the genre. Like I said, not just about combat in America, but the occupation of America. And when you think about how Americans feel about it, that's something actually we want to play off of, because you have this association with what they experience in their everyday lives. And it's not about fighting for the Capitol building. It's a fight about fighting for your backyards, for the places you shop and, were raised type of thing. Because I think everybody here has such a strong sense of attachment to that when you put them in that world and then when you twist it by this storyline and this occupation, it actually is much more engaging and compelling than sort of just a generic American backdrop.
So how is it for you as an American? You mentioned World in Conflict and you mentioned Freedom Fighters, and both of those are, like, World in Conflict is Swedish. Go Sweden. And I think Freedom Fighters is Danish, I believe, from IO. You're an American company. How's that been for you personally, or for you guys as the team, to create this world?
Well, personally, I'm Canadian, but obviously we have a lot of Americans.
Isn't that like that's kind of like Sweden and Switzerland? Isn't that the same thing?
Kind of, yeah. It's really one thing we're actually trying to stay away from is this flag-waving American patriotism game. It's really more about creating a compelling, plausible scenario. So, I think that Americans are going to be drawn to that. So many you see images of occupation and oppression happening on the news, but it's always happening to other countries and overseas. And the idea of what if it happened here and what if America was changed with those events, I think is pretty fresh and it really is going to be compelling to Americans and even non-Americans.
So we haven't talked that much about the actual game. It's a first-person shooter, is it? Is there anything more? Anything you're adding to the first-person mix than just a compelling storyline?
As far as the gameplay goes, well, one of the things is, like I mentioned before, you're playing as a civilian resistance, a civilian freedom fighter, right? So you're always outnumbered, you're always outgunned, you don't have the best technology, you don't have power of men and numbers behind you. So just in terms of how the missions flow, and you'll be on the run, you'll be being hunted. When you have an assault, which we're showing at E3 here, you do have one piece of military tech that you've managed to steal, which is this Goliath autonomous combat vehicle. So it's autonomous, it positions itself autonomously, it targets people autonomously, but you have control over its rockets, so you can give it targets. So there's a little bit of this future weapons twist to it as well, and you can think of it kind of as your sidekick in the game. And then, the Resistance also has to rely on things that are sort of morally questionable. In the demo we're showing today, you assault this lumber liquidator store. Real-world brands is also an important part of this, creating this America. And you use a white phosphorus blast to kind of even the odds against as many Korean soldiers defending it. And some of the Resistance is a little sort of queasy about what that does, because it's a horrible sort of fire, death, burning weapon. So there's some of these conventional and unconventional weaponry that you have in the game with a little bit of a future twist, but a lot of our gameplay sort of enhancements and unique features and so on is going to come in the multiplayer side, which we're going to start talking about in a few months.
Any details about multiplayer?
Well, I can tell you that it's going to be a large-scale warfare game. Multiplayer and that style of multiplayer is really the bread and butter of Chaos in many ways, from Desert Combat and Battlefield 2 and Frontlines. So we're very excited about that. It's actually a huge part of the game, and narratively, it's not about Resistance versus the military. It's actually the skirmishes that happen sort of leading up to the year of 2027 between the U.S. military and the Korean military. So large-scale warfare, tanks, helicopters, all that good stuff with some new twists that we brought to the plate.
How far into production are you?
We're going to be shipping in early 2011, so we're kind of wrapping up production, heading into the finaling of the game.
Thank you very much for your time.